Welcome back, everybody. I had to take a couple of weeks off the channel to basically move into a new house, so if it's been a little while since you've seen a posting of a video, I apologize for it, but we're back, and I got something brand new for you. This one is called Drawing Erica. And now, by means of introduction, I'll just state right off the bat here that Erica is not a celebrity. She is actually somebody that lives locally in my new neighborhood where I just moved. She's a bartender at a local bar, and she was kind enough to allow me to take a few pictures of her so I could attempt a caricature. This is one of the pictures I took while she was on duty, and she thought this was a great picture to use for the caricature, so we're going to kind of move forward and use that as our reference in our piece. Now, I'd like to take some time in this video to focus on the pre-drawing of our caricature. I don't really spend a lot of time emphasizing that in a lot of my previous videos, so I thought this might be a great example of an opportunity to do so. So in this initial pre-drawing stage, I think it's really necessary to point out that what I'm not attempting at this point is a resemblance. That can be a tricky thing. The point of the caricature is to try to draw the resemblance of a person, but it's not my focus in this initial stage of the drawing. Right now, it's just kind of me feeling out some of the lines that I'm going to be getting myself familiar with, some of the shapes that I want to be used to using throughout the piece, and also trying to hone in on what aspects of Erica's face that I'm going to try to emphasize and ultimately exaggerate. Now, there are a couple of choices I could be making here. Erica has a lot of unique features that make recognizing her in a drawing very easy. We could speak to her hair, we could speak to her eyes and her makeup. She's actually very proud of her eyebrows and how, her words, on fleek they are. But in addition to that, I also happen to notice she had rather full lips, and I chose to use her hair and her full lips as something of the exaggeration for this particular piece. Now, your mileage may vary. Focus on eyes, focus on nose, whatever you may want to do, as long as you're looking for some sense of accuracy in your exaggeration. So what I mean by that is that even though I'm choosing to exaggerate her lips and make them larger than they normally are, notice that the shapes still conform to the actual shapes of the lips that we see in the picture. And if you take a close look at the reference picture, you can kind of see the reason I chose her lips here. She has a rather unique shape to her lips. Not that they're bad or good or anything like that, but they're unique to her. You won't see that particular shape of mouth in very many people. And so emphasizing on that and blowing it up, making it a little bit larger, but also focusing on the accuracy of the forms and shapes is what's going to help guide you towards that resemblance of Erica a little bit later on. I'm not focused on that in the initial stage. I just want to kind of get an idea of what it is I want to emphasize. So you notice I drew big lips in my initial drawing, but they don't really resemble the shapes and forms I'm going to be striving for in future versions of this piece. Now, another example of this can also be found in the lower portion of her body, below her neck, where I'm drawing in her torso and her arms. None of this is represented in the picture. I'm making this up just to have her do something in terms of a narrative in the picture. So you can see that now that I'm past my initial phase of the drawing, I'm going to focus now on getting in something that's a little bit more maybe realistic in terms of proportion. I know realistic is a difficult word to use when we're referring to caricature, but again, realism is what's going to drive the resemblance. So my first initial phase of the drawing, I'm just trying to throw something down to give me an idea of what it is I want to focus my attention on. And once I have that mapped out, my second version of this drawing is now going to be making sure that I'm focusing on the forms and shapes that will give me the resemblance that I'm striving for. It might also be helpful to mention here that at this phase, even though I'm in my second or third version of my drawing, I'm still very much in edit and problem-solving mode. And a great example of this is in the action, the narrative that we're trying to tell here. Erica's a bartender, so I have her pouring or mixing a drink, but I don't really quite like the way her hands are showing up in frame here. So I'm making some adjustments, I'm changing things on the fly. In essence, I'm editing my composition. And that's something that I'm going to keep on doing all the way through up until I get to my final inks. And once I get to my inks, I feel like that's where I kind of settle in on what the final version of this composition should be. Because once I start coloring, the phase that comes right after inking, backing up at that point gets very difficult because making changes would be changing 4, 5, or 6, 7 different layers at the same time based on the way I kind of organize my workload. Now, if you have questions about how I organize layers, I have tutorial videos on this subject. Feel free to take a look at some links I'll put up in the upper right-hand corner. They'll show you some playlists for some of my tutorials. However, if you have more specific questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm happy to kind of spill all my secrets on how I manage layers, how I manage blending modes, and all that sort of thing when it comes to the toolbox that Procreate has to offer. I've been working in Procreate for maybe about 2-3 years now. I'm pretty familiar with the software. There's not a lot they can do to surprise me at this point, but I do have a very specific work method that I go through, and that doesn't necessarily mean I use all the tools all the time, but I use them as I need them. So again, if you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know. I'm happy to make a video. Just let me know what you need. Now, as we finish up on the drawing here, I can see that we're very kind of far into the coloring stage at this point, and there's good reason for it. A lot of my videos focus on the how-to when it comes to coloring, lighting, and shadow, so I'm not really going to be focusing on it in this video. And one thing I might also mention is the background. The background there is not something I rendered. It's actually a photograph of the location, or at least a piece of the location where Erica works there. So it's something of a background photo that I pasted in there, but just to give it a little bit more of a background depth feel to it, I put a blue layer over top of it and lowered the opacity so it just kind of looked like a pale blue sitting over top of that background. And then the photo itself, I also gave a Gaussian blur at about 2 or 3%, just to give it that sense that it's just sitting slightly behind her. And if you look at it from that angle, you can see that creates a sort of depth, that she's standing in the foreground and there's definitively a background behind her. Now, we're going to be finishing up the coloring here by rendering the liquid that's in her drink. And you kind of notice I saved it for last for a reason. It can be a little bit intimidating. I tried just a couple of experimental methods on this to figure out how to render something look vaguely like liquid, and ultimately the experiment just kind of worked first time out. So I didn't really spend a lot of time figuring out how to do it, other than just kind of saying I wanted a little bit of a color in here that I wanted to look like alcohol. I just chose red because I didn't have a lot of red otherwise, and then ultimately just put in some highlights and shine to give it an idea that it was flowing liquid, and it just seemed to kind of pop and look right. So I left it. Now, that's coming up a little bit later. I did happen to forget to mention Erica's hair, which is an actually very unique portion of her caricature as well. Her hair was actually pretty simple to render. It looks intimidating because it's a lot of stuff going on there with the dreads and the multiple colors, but the reality is that I just didn't make myself so reliant on the picture. I wasn't so concerned with accuracy in the picture in the sense that I didn't want to render every strand exactly as it appears in the photograph. I did get this sense of a messy tangle of dreadlocks, but I could achieve that without having to make sure that every single strand followed the photograph exactly. And giving myself that artistic freedom allowed me to kind of get a little bit loose with it and create the rendering of the hair that you see there that I think really kind of captures the look that Erica has in the photograph without getting absolute dead-on accuracy. Okay, now let's finish this off here. A little bit of a kind of review of how we got to this point. So if we just take a look at our final piece here, we can see that there are also some tattoos rendered. I'll speak to tattoos in another video, but again, leave some questions if you have them. But ultimately what we end up starting with here is her photograph. And using that photograph, we get a rough sketch where we're not focused on resemblance. Getting into our second stage, into our inks, we then start focusing on getting those forms and shape to create the resemblance. And when we get into final inking stage, we can start using that final ink to create almost like a coloring book pattern to be able to start laying in color and ultimately get to our end piece, which is where we get to here. I've already shown this to Erica. She was a big fan of it. It was actually posted on my on her Instagram page, and from there I got some followers. So look, if you haven't done so already, subscribe, like, share, and I'm also on Instagram at JJAtkinsArt. So go follow me there also. Thanks a lot. Come on back. I'll have more soon. Take care.